Kaaina, thank you so much for taking time out of, I know what must be a very busy schedule. There's so much going on with the county and so many things to talk about. So without further ado, let me bring you on and let's talk about what we're going to be discussing today. The main topic is ARUs and ADUs, and I'm going to leave the explanation to you. And we'll go over the guidelines. We'll talk about sort of the bigger Kauai housing picture, a little bit of what's going on with the vacation rental industry, and you can explain to our viewers, where planning comes in and the role that planning plays in that, and a little bit about COVID-19. So let's start, and I'll hand it over to you, and we'll begin.
Okay. So the picture of additional dwelling units and additional rental units. To take a step back and kind of look at the overall policies and why they're created. Ultimately, these policies for dwelling units and rental units were created at the council administrative level in order to ease the housing pressures of the county of Kauai, and in particular in the housing crisis we're in. The ADU, or additional dwelling unit policy, actually was implemented well before my time. In fact, I think it was implemented a year before I was born, back in 1980. And that was, it's simply just a policy of, if your property only qualifies for one dwelling unit, you can build an additional dwelling unit. Sometimes referred to as ohana dwelling units, but on Kauai, you don't have to necessarily be family. It's just another additional dwelling unit you can construct and have somebody rent or sell it off on your property, in the scenario in which your property only qualifies for one dwelling unit. So that's been in place for quite some time now, about 40 years roughly. And we've gotten approximately 1,000 additional dwelling units constructed within the residential zoning district during that time period. A few years ago, in looking at how many ADUs have been constructed and easing the housing crisis, or at least giving some alternative, definitely didn't provide a solution, but kind of chipped away at that scenario. The county council and the planning department and the administration began discussions of an additional rental unit bill. I won't go into the whole process of getting that passed, but ultimately about a year and a half to 2 years ago, it was adopted that residential, with those properties within the residential zoning district, can also have now the entitlement to an additional rental unit. And so an additional rental unit has very specific measures on it, that it can be no larger than 800 square feet, and it can't be CPR'd off, but it's another unit on top of whatever dwelling units your property qualifies for. So if your property qualifies for one house, and the layout in zoning terms is residential R1, residential R2, residential R4. R1 depicting you're entitled to one house per acre, R2, 2 houses per acre, R4, 4 houses per acre, and so on and so forth. So in the screenshot you're looking at right now, any property in the residential R1 zoning district qualifies at less than 71,000 square feet, qualifies for only one house. So if your property qualifies for one house, you qualify for an additional dwelling unit. With the ARU policy now enacted, that property in the R1 zoning district that's under 71,000 square feet qualifies for one house, one additional dwelling unit, and now you also qualify for one ARU per dwelling unit. So one ARU for your main dwelling unit and one ARU for your additional dwelling unit, giving you the entitlement in this scenario to 4 habitable units on your property, and those can be attached or detached structures. It's whichever the property owner decides to pursue. And Ron, if you go to the next slide, the next slide kind of shows that if you have, and the top area is that 71,000 square feet in the R1 zoning district qualifies you now for 2 units. 115,000 square feet in the R1 district qualifies you for 3 units. 158,000 qualifies you for 4 units, and 202,000 qualifies you for 5 units. So for each one of those dwelling units that you qualify for, you now also qualify for an ARU. With that scenario as well, you also can qualify for a guest house, and a guest house can be up to 500 square feet. And previously, there was a lot of consternation. You can't have kitchens in guest houses, and back and forth the policy went, but the policy is officially adopted that you can opt to have a kitchen in your guest house. Now it is an option. You can have a guest house without a kitchen, you can have a guest house with a kitchen. So you're looking at essentially a property that now qualifies, you have that slide up now, Ron. That kind of depicts a dwelling unit, an ADU, an ARU, or a guest house. These are all habitable structures. In almost all the scenarios, you do have to have a kitchen and bathroom to ensure habitation is possible, but the guest house is optional. And then if you go to the next slide, Ron. So this is the configuration for properties that have a specific build out. This configuration was not to confuse. It doesn't count in the potential for an ADU. So that one house option, actually, you can also do an ADU. But just taking away the ADU paradigm, and I apologize, this pamphlet that we're putting out is still in the rough draft proposal. We intend to put pamphlets out for all the zoning districts so that respective property owners can come in and see their development paradigm that exists for the respective zoning district, given whether you're R1, R2, R4. This was just for R1, and so it's still a working draft. But essentially, this kind of lines out what your property, if your property qualifies for one house, here's the schematic for you now qualify for one house, an ARU, and a guest house. You do have the ADU capability, but that's a little later. For those properties that qualify for 2 houses, the schematic just shows you got 2 houses, 2 ARUs, and a guest house. 3 houses, 3 ARUs, and a guest house, and so on and so forth. And that applies again in the R1, R2, R4, R6. So just depending what your acreage size is in those districts and what district you're particularly in will determine your density count. And now you have the ability, again, to construct an ARU with each density you're entitled to. So we've essentially, from a zoning perspective, doubled the density of all properties. So you now have the ability to construct those smaller units for, kapuna that you might want to take care of, elderly caring in place, parents, grandparents, as well as children coming home from college, might not be able to get right into the housing market. A smaller unit can be constructed. And that's what we've done from a zoning perspective. That also, though, is still contingent upon the infrastructure being adequate for the area. You still have to have access to appropriate wastewater systems as well as water systems to be able to provide the necessary off-street parking. Generally, for a dwelling unit, you require 2 off-street parking stalls per unit. For ARUs, it's restricted. You only need to provide 1 off-street parking stall, but you still have to have the infrastructure there that's necessary to habitate an area. So that is the one major caveat of this. And that's kind of it in a nutshell. I guess I'm open, Pat, Ron, anybody viewing, if you have any questions or clarifying.
We do have a question. Can you hear me? We do have a question from a resident here on Kauai. It says, I'm surrounded by vacation rentals. My question, will I be notified if the renters are quarantined and if they have negative COVID results? If not, what are my options? And can their TVR permit be revoked?
So right now it's a little definitely outside of the ARU ADU discussion. But
yes, that was the first. That was just the first question that came up. We'll come back to that one.
Yeah, let's rewind for a second. Kaaina, for those people that are looking at buying homes here, or people that already have homes here, let's just say that you watch this video and you kind of understand the basic definition or delineation in terms of what you can and can't have. For an individual to pursue getting one of these, what are the steps they would need to take? Like, walk me through. I decide I've heard about it. I want to build one. You know, where do I start?
The best thing to start is just to come into the planning department, and or you can go online and get an ARU, what's referred to as an ARU clearance form. And the ARU clearance form just addresses, one, do you have the enough density for however many number of ARUs you want to construct? If you're just constructing one ARU and you're in the residential zoning district, every dwelling unit qualifies now for an ARU. So you have the density for it if you're just going for one. But if you want to do multiple, you have to find that out from the planning department. But we have a clearance form that essentially is easy. You just fill out the TMK for your property and your name, and you kind of submit it through. Before COVID, you as a property owner would have to walk around to each agency to ensure that you have adequate infrastructure. During COVID, wanting to really facilitate the process, my staff will actually walk those ARU forms through the various agencies to get them to provide their comments. So you literally right now just have to submit an ARU form with your name and tax map key to my office, and we will submit it to all the agencies to determine whether or not your property has adequate infrastructure. And that's just the first step. A lot of people had pushback saying, why would you create another layer of paperwork? Why can't people just apply for the permit? And we want to be careful on that because some places don't have adequate infrastructure. You don't want somebody dropping $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 on plans only to find out they don't have enough water flow there, or sewer isn't hooked up in that area, and they're kind of out that 20 grand because their property doesn't necessarily qualify for it. So come into our office first. You can do it online and submit it digitally to our office, and we'll go off of just your name and tax map key and get that verification for you.
Great, thank you for that. You know, let's rewind. I remember back when I was on the board of directors and you were the deputy director of planning at that time, and you came to a few of our board meetings. Give our viewers a sense of how this ARU thing evolved and what the intention was in adding that to one of the options for housing here.
Yeah, because I think a real 50,000 foot view of it is there's this whole notion of Kauai getting overdeveloped. There's too much development going on. We need to stop development. And so when we started really unpeeling that onion of numbers and where development's happening and where development or the market is coming from, you know, we all expected, well, a lot of it is just to feed into the, you know, mainland speculative buyers or international buyers really looking for second homes and snowbirds and whatnot. And what we found is that Kauai is in fact growing. It's a nominal amount of growth. It's about roughly 1% a year. So it's not huge, but it's growth. And where, you know, a lot of people assumed all that growth is coming from snowbirds moving to here from the mainland, retirees or what have you. We were actually pretty amazed to find that no, in fact, a large contingent of our growth, and when the ARU bill came out, the majority of our growth was actual internal numbers. Our growth rate, well, I should say our birth rate is exceeding our death rate almost, you know, to the tune of we're dying at 200 to 300 people a year and 500 to 600 births a year. And it's kind of morbid to talk about death versus birth rates. But in planning and long range planning, you have to look at those numbers. And so when we're looking at the majority of our growth was coming actually not from mainland buyers or international buyers. There's some of that real small, is about 150, I think, at the time of the ARU bill, compared to our 500 to 600 birth rate figure. We looked at those numbers, and then also we do have some in-migration, or say migration from out of state, but again, it wasn't the primary contributor to that wasn't the mainland buyer or the international speculative buyer. It was East Asia, places like the Philippines, where people were just really coming here because their family is already here. And so just looking at those being contributing factors, in particular, again, the birth rate, taking this no development standpoint was a no-go for us. If you take a no development standpoint, looking at the numbers of where our growth is coming from, so much of it's internal, our own birth rate, that position of no development says one day to the keiki of this island, you have to move out. If you're outpacing our death rate and we're not going to grow, we're not going to develop, we're not going to build, that means one day you will not have a place to live or work. So therefore you have to leave. And the mayor at that time, and I know the mayor today, do not take a no growth position given our current internal growth numbers, is that we do have to provide a place for our keiki. Should they want to live here, should they choose to habitate and work here, we need to provide those areas to work and live in. So the question then is, where do we focus our growth? How do we, it's not a question of do we need to develop, it is a question, absolutely we need to develop, but we need to be able to focus it in a manner that we want to grow our areas responsibly and accordingly to the way that the communities want. And so much of that outreach to the communities, there was a lot of input saying, yes, we need to develop for our keiki, we need to develop for our families and put roofs over their heads. But we don't want to spill out into agricultural land or into our open lands. Let's preserve that. Let's preserve those open areas. And let's start looking at infilling our town cores. There's still so much space and still a lot of infrastructure capacity in some areas to accommodate for growth. So let's look at infilling these areas. And so from a large landowner perspective, there are a lot of policy changes going on, from things called form-based code and creating special planning areas that incentivize certain types of larger scale developments in our town cores. But looking on the smaller scale, looking at the mom and pop owners who just own a small property but want to be able to possibly provide for kapuna te care in place or to provide for returning children from college, that's where the ARU bill was essentially kind of spun up to say, to use smaller property owners, you're not necessarily a massive developer, but to provide at least an option of one or two more smaller units for you to construct on your property. Very akin to the way that the ADU was proposed back in the 80s and provided at least 1,000 units, looking at kind of an ADU 2.0, if you will, with this additional rental unit bill. And so it's kind of long-winded, but that's kind of in the grand scheme of things where or how that policy evolved.
So you expressed, an awareness of or you explained a little bit of our dilemma that we're growing, organically. And many people might think that's not the case. So it's good for us to know that. What do you see planning's role, in the whole, because this is it's an American challenge, Kauai is not different than so many places around the world, probably, and certainly in America. What do you see the planning department's role to, helping to mitigate that? And I guess the second part to the question, you're only one department within the county, but what are your thoughts? You've been doing this for a while and you recognize that we have a challenge. What do you see your role in that?
Planning and my role at the helm of it right now is really to make sure we understand what our problems are. And like you alluded to, Ron, a lot of people don't think there's a growth issue going on here, that it is the mainland, retiree or second buyer that is being built for, or that we need to, is only people moving or contributing to growth. So first, from a planning perspective, we need to unpeel the numbers to figure out where the actual problem is at. And then from there, to make a guided decision in solutions. Once understanding that we need to address this growth issue, it's a problem, but an issue, and much of it is internal growth. Then we need to really outreach with our communities, to sit down at the tables with them and genuinely get, where does this community want to go? Where does it want to evolve in the next 20 years? And set the stage via our community plan. So we have a general plan that gets adopted every 20 years, 10 to 20 years, it depends on the horizon, or the planning horizon is the term. And that sets the policies for the entire island, where growth should be strategized, where capital improvements and infrastructure should be spun up or updated or upgraded. And then from that general plan, from an island-wide standpoint, community plans are done for each of the respective community, because Kapaa is not Waimea and Lihue is not Hanalei. Each place is unique. Each community is unique. So to ensure that those communities strategize their development paradigm and program the way that the community wants it. And so we spent about 2 years in South Kauai a few years ago, just working with that community on their community plan was ultimately adopted. We are currently at the tail end of the West Kauai community plan. And really, again, it's holding meetings with them, giving the numbers, holding charrettes, going back and forth with workshops and dialoguing to get where this community wants to go. And that's the ultimate role of the planning department in this whole development paradigm.
When it's having a problem getting on the stream. Wow. It's a little hard to multitask. Talk a little bit about kind of when that law was passed. Or I guess, I don't know if it's a law, it's an ordinance, the ARU ordinance, when it was implemented, and what has happened since that time. How has it been embraced? Are people doing them? I had one question. Well, I'll ask that question, or Kat will ask it in a minute. Talk a little bit about that, if you would.
Yeah, for the most part, it has been generally embraced, at least for the people that understand it. It's a new paradigm of allowing new entitlements and new development rights to smaller property owners. And so it takes a while for that to kind of solidify. You know, when we first passed it, some of the council members were like, what's the numbers? What do we expect here? We haven't got a housing crisis here. What were we, 20, 30, 40, 50 the first year? And I was explaining to the council members and explaining to you folks, Ron, is that it takes a while for the property owners, the contractors, the realtors like yourself to really begin to soak in and sometimes through osmosis, really understand this new paradigm. And so when the ADU law was passed, for the most part, contractors, realtors, pretty much they understand how ADUs work right now. And it's just fine. You guys understand it, and it's part of the dialogue. When that thing was first passed back in the 80s, the first 2 or 3 years, there were only a couple permits. And this is because it was a new paradigm. And so right now what's going on with the ARUs is actually we've gotten, I think, 40 or 50 applications in the past year and a half. I think 16 to 20 of them are actually in the pipe for building permits, which some people might think that's great, some people might not think that's great. And I'd say within the time frame of 1 and 2 years, and people still getting adjusted to the paradigm, it's actually more than I expected in the first year or two. We don't really expect it to take off until, again, the development community, the property owners, really become acculturated to this new paradigm. So I really appreciate you having me and our team on here to kind of explain it. We absolutely want to help people that are interested in these new entitlements, get them into the ground and constructed. It's part of why we're doing this pamphlet. Sorry it's not fully ready for you folks. We hope to have it ready in the next week or two. And off of this pamphlet, we'll also be doing a series of educational videos that we'll be hosting on the county website as well. So it's all about education. I really appreciate the time you guys are having here.
Yeah. Ken, I think we have a question from Facebook. You want to present it there?
Let's see, from Facebook. This is a question from Juno and Apala. Hey, Juno. Can Kaaina talk about a bit more about density and the concerns with rapid growth and the impact to infrastructure to our communities?
Yeah, and I hope I'm addressing Juno's question correctly. Density is essentially how many dwelling units your property is entitled to, or habitable structures your property is entitled to. So we have, through the ARU policy for the residential district within our town cores, we have doubled the density, if you will, for our residential zoning district across the island. With the exception of Hanalei, or to say north of the Hanalei Bridge, there were considerable and I'd say genuine concerns about increasing density north of the Hanalei Bridge because of the limited access that area has for evacuation routes, and it's in the tsunami inundation zone. So that was ultimately put on hold, but we've doubled the density for our residential zoning district. Some individuals and some people I know object to doubling the density in the town cores, and within our existing urban footprint, if you will, and would request that the county look at allowing for further subdivision and further easing of restrictions on, say, agricultural land. The problem we from planning and from the county have with that is essentially twofold. One, there's been a strong push from communities when we're in them to say, no, preserve what we have from an agricultural open space landscape issue, and don't let the towns bleed into each other. Let them have separate and distinct parts, that they're separate and apart from each other via these open spaces. So there's that aspect of just the built environment, and controlling it in a manner that preserves our open spaces. That's one aspect. But there's also the other aspect of we just can't afford it as far as urban or suburban sprawl out into these open areas. And one study that kind of demonstrates that is the more we sprawl outward, the more cost it is on infrastructure. It's exponentially more expensive for us to install and then maintain or upgrade infrastructure in a suburban sprawl type of footprint area. Just imagine when you have 1 acre that has a multifamily unit on it, say 40 unit multifamily housing. That 1 acre, right, is fed with all the infrastructure, the water lines, the sewer lines, the roadways going just right there. The postal service has got their one, kiosk mailbox that all the mail goes into, versus a 40 acre, 1 unit per acre subdivision in which we have to send the lines out and maintain and upgrade them, as well as your trash pickup and all these other things like postal drop offs take that much more time. One number that I use a considerable amount is for our roadways. The Federal Highway Division did a study for the County of Kauai for our roads. I'm looking at all the roads we have on Kauai right now, and the projected roads that we have on the books over the next 20 years. Actually, that report is actually 16 years. It's 4 years old, so it's actually 16 years now. It projected the cost of maintaining those roads for 20 years, and it's $3.2 billion. Now, within federal funding, billions, millions, a lot of people just don't pay so much attention because it's just so high up there. But to give, perspective to this, and the Federal Highways Division went a little bit further and said, Kauai, you're expected, of that $3.2 billion in the next 20 years, we've also crunched the numbers of how much money you're going to have for roads with your current tax revenues, with current federal monies coming into you, with current state level of monies coming into you. For the next 20 years, for that $3.2 billion check, you're going to have $600 million to spend for it. So Kauai, you're on the hook for $2.2 billion over the next 20 years that you don't have anywhere laying around, which comes out to roughly, $100 million a year for the next 20 years. And saying, we don't know where you're going to figure that out, but you're going to have to find it to maintain these roads. And to some perspective, the county of Kauai's budget is roughly about double that. So if we're to do it and our only revenue source is from real property, we'd have to increase real property taxes by 50%, right? Like you try to touch real property taxes like 2 or 3%, heads are going to roll. But just to maintain our road stock as we sent it and suburbanized out, what might have seemed okay development patterns, 20 or 30 years ago, we're now getting the tab for it just from our roadway infrastructure. And so what we're saying is, we understand that certain people do want to live a lifestyle that is much more outward, and you have those acres, but there's going to be a price tag attached to that as far as looking where we can and where it's appropriate, and we're going to spin up more density as it is less costly to the taxpayer. It is doing so within the urban town cores. I hope that answers Juna's question. I think that's where she's going with. I'm not sure.
Kat, we have another question there that came up. You want to
This is
ask that?
from, sure. This is from a Kauai resident. They're asking, what's the approximate timeline for such an ARU to start building? And can newly built units be made of single wall construction?
The permit time, as long as, again, all the infrastructure is there, it is about permitting time about a month and a half to 2 months. And that's, again, contingent upon the infrastructure being there. If the infrastructure isn't there, then your permit's ultimately going to get denied just because the water can't provide access, provide service there. Wastewater, and I want to be abundantly clear here, wastewater is going to be the magic bullet in this. Because of the fact that you can only have, if your property is less than 20,000 square feet, you can only have one septic system on that property. Pursuant to Department of Health rules, you need 10,000 square feet for every septic system. They make, exemptions if your property is smaller than that and you want to upgrade from cesspool to septic because it's safer. But for any new septic systems beyond that, you need 10,000 square feet per septic system. And so in the development paradigm, everybody's going to construct the house and the ADU first, right? The ARU is probably going to come second, or third, I should say. But a septic system can only handle at a max 2 kitchens or 5 bedrooms, which was essentially at a max 2 dwelling units. So that ARU will generally, not in all scenarios, but generally will be that third unit. And if you don't have 20,000 square feet from a septic system, you're probably not going to be able to get to the Department of Health. That is, notwithstanding if your property is sewered. If your property is sewered, that's really where we're going to see a lot of development potential for these ARUs. But again, just to highlight, it is contingent upon having adequate infrastructure, and wastewater and water are going to be 2 of the primary areas you as a property owner have to watch. But permitting wise, as long as you've got those and meet the other standards, you're looking at about a month and a half to 2 months. And that was before COVID, quite honestly. And for your viewers, I would ask if anybody is interested, come in now, because with a limited front counter service, our front counter techs are just streaming through the permits. I think on average, I just got the numbers from January to the end of March. We're doing, each permit tech was doing, I think roughly within that time frame, did about 300 permits reviewed and took action on. In the same time frame in COVID, when they're teleworking from home and still doing their work, they average about 600 permits during that same time frame. So now's kind of the time to come in for permits. If you folks are kind of sitting on them, don't wait. At least get the entitlements now, because we're here. So could be just about a month if somebody's submitting right now because of the downtime from front counter service.
Could you tell our viewers, just people that are maybe looking, to buy a second home here or retire here, the real estate market itself for the last 3 months has slowed down. The number of properties listed and then the number of properties sold and the dollar volume of properties has been down between 60 and 70% in April, May, and June. But we've also been very low in our virus count. And, our sense on all the neighbor islands is that that's going to make the state very, very attractive. If you're in a mainland place and, you're thinking about it, you think about retirement or, where's a safe place to go? Because now our paradigm, our mindset about where we want to live has shifted quite a bit. And for people that are thinking that way, just give us a broad brushstroke. What are the areas on Kauai where we actually have sewer? Because it's not that many, is it?
Yeah, there's only certain areas. Some parts of Princeville are sewered. Much of Princeville is sewered. If I go north to west, Princeville, much of Lower Kauai is sewered going up to the hospital, but then past the hospital it's not sewered. Then getting into Lihue, Hanamalu is also sewered. And then getting to Lihue and Puhi, those areas for the most part are sewered. Almost all the areas. There's a few straggler parts that aren't. Then Poipu is sewered. There is no sewer in Kaloa, but it is very close to getting a sewer. There's a lot of a lot of people watching that. There's, with the EPA fines that have come down for large capacity cesspools, Koloa is very close to getting a sewer system in. And then LA is also sewered, as well as parts of Hanapepe. And then Waimea is also sewered. But there are, in all those areas, there are outlier areas that don't necessarily have access to a sewer line.
Thank you for doing that. One last thing to touch on before we segue into another topic. I had Luke Evslin, one of our county council people and someone who's running to serve on the council again, talk with us a couple months ago. And talk again for our viewers about some of the financial issues, some of the infrastructure costs. My understanding is I don't know if the legislation's passed, it's still an ongoing dialogue with the county in terms of some ways to financially mitigate what might be a barrier for someone putting an ARU in terms of infrastructure costs.
Yeah, Councilmember Evslin had a bill or series of bills, just looking at it, and to take a step back before even getting into that is just the cost of it. And people look at why do houses cost so much here in Hawaii? Some of that is just dependent upon the fact that it is a very limited land supply. Some of that is, and much of it is actually contingent upon the fact that we have to ship these materials here, and that is there's a fairly costly factor to that. But another part is just the cost of infrastructure and planning or permitting review, I'll say. On your average house, you can spend 20, even sometimes higher, 20,000 a little higher on the architectural stamp and the plans. You're going to spend another possibly 14,000 on a water facilities reserve charge. You're going to spend another 20 to sometimes 30,000 on a septic system, and then another anywhere from a couple grand to 10 or 15 grand on the building permit review fees. And so recognizing that before you even stick a shovel in the ground to construct these houses, you're getting charged $100,000. And so what we see often, right, like that $100,000 amount to a large scale speculative developer, if you will, who's going to build a mansion and put it on the speculative market for $5-6 million, what have you, that $100,000 isn't much of a barrier, right? It's a small drop relatively small drop in the bucket to that type of development. To the type of development we want, the type of development kind of spurred on by local families, the smaller 800-900 square foot structures, 2 or 3 bedrooms, right? That might cost $250,000-$300,000 to construct. That $100,000 there is a massive barrier, which is why, among other things, we see a lot of the development paradigm in Kauai, where you see these massive homes being constructed and not the smaller homes aimed at local families. And which is why, in many people's minds, we're only developing for the speculative mainland international market because that's all you see getting developed. But in recognizing, and we, many of us here in the county administration, Mr. Evslin and others on the county council definitely recognize that government and the cost of it has in a way served as a barrier, ensuring that the local families cannot construct because they can't afford that $100,000, and the only ones that can are those large-scale luxury high-end. And so what Councilmember Evslin was trying to do with those bills, and we've tried to do in other areas, is to begin to reduce the amount that it would cost to construct these smaller units from the front end. And so reducing the building permit, or absolutely, I think Councilmember Evslin's bill essentially took away virtually all of the permitting fees for additional rental units. And being that additional rental units are aimed at the residential town core areas, as well as they're limited to 800 square feet, much of that market or much of those people habitating in those structures are going to be local families. There's no guarantee that, and that's part of a constitutional, we can't stop people from renting it, but for the most part, it's going to be aimed at local families. Is where Councilmember Evslin was going with that bill and ultimately was adopted. So reducing infrastructure there. We're having further discussions at the water department, the facilities reserve charge, that $14,000 upfront charge on a single family dwelling, that $2-3 million dwelling, not too bad. The 250,000 square foot or $250,000 dwelling that local families are building, that's a significant chunk. And seeing where we can kind of reduce that in particular methods is at the forefront of, again, beginning to ensure that local families are able to construct with less barriers in front of them.
I had another question, but it slipped my mind. We do have an online question, and I'm going to add to it. Lynn is asking if there's an online map showing where sewer is at, and I want to add to that. Where are we in terms of perhaps having some type of digital system for Kauai residents to understand where the zoning is? You know, something I heard from our MLS provider that they were looking at integrating something like that, but I think that's something that people that are interested in housing, you know, would find really valuable. Do we have a tool like that yet, or is that something in the works?
Yeah, we do, and all of our maps that we work with internally here at my office is digitized, or are digitized. We were planning to put that up online for you folks, and I'd say that it actually fell by the wayside. As we look at the need for development and, you know, homers going in right now, it was kind of at our forefront to put it up. The one snag on it was we had to get a legal disclaimer on it because, you know, density is determined by size and zoning. And so the digital maps aren't a official survey, right? In order to find out your official size of your lot, and especially if it's split zone, you got residential and open zoning district, right? Having that line go left or right a few feet can be the determination between several $100,000. So these digital maps we're putting up, but we got into a snag because of the legal disclaimer. We're pretty much there, so we hope to have it up by the end of the month.
Fantastic. Well, you've given us a wealth of information. Let's segue and talk about planning's role in our vacation rental industry and some recent articles that were in the press about agreements with some of the large vacation rental providers. That sounds like it's a big win for you and your group there.
Yeah. So the County of Kauai has had a vacation rental ordinance in play for close to a decade now. That's unlike some of the other islands. Hawaii Island and Oahu recently went through their own vacation rental bills. But we've had one in play on Kauai for close to a decade now. It's relatively simple in that we have a visitor destination area. The visitor destination area primarily where resort type activities are outright permissible. That's Princeville, parts of Nuwili and Lihue around the Marriott, Poipu, and Kapa'a, the Coconut Coast. Those are the visitor destination area, and transient vacation rentals, or otherwise known as single family or dwelling units that are used for transient purposes, are outright permissible in those areas. Outside of their areas, they're expressly prohibited. And the reason being is you know, we've seen the detrimental effects of large scale resort uses in residential areas, whether it be in the driving up of taxes and prices, as well as just the impact of a lot of traffic, noise, what have you, just erosion of the neighborhood fabric. They're prohibited outside of those visitor destination areas. However, when that prohibition went into place, we legally had to grandfather or allow for those vacation rental uses that were occurring outside of the visitor destination previous to the prohibition to be allowed to be grandfathered in. And so there's roughly 420 or 450 of those that receive these grandfathered certificates, and they annually have to renew them. So that's just how our law works. You have to be in the VDA, otherwise you're prohibited, with the exception of those 450 that were grandfathered. There's no new permits or certificates being given outside of the VDA. And so that's just how our system works. Our department is tasked with that renewal of those certificates, as well as ensuring that the vacation rental industry doesn't operate illegally outside of the VDA or visitor destination area again. And so we've spent several years building up our program essentially citing and issuing notices and pushing those users that are trying to illegally operate outside of the VDA, pushing them back into compliance. I will say that, on average, we give about 150 to 200 violation notices a year over the past 7, 8 years, well, 4 or 5 years, to illegal operators. The vast majority of notices we give out, they come into compliance. Many of them are just unawares that they're not supposed to be operating. Most of them come into compliance. A handful don't. The handful that don't, we do issue fines on them. Can be a strict penalty of up to $10,000. But the vast majority that get the fine, for the most part, they come to compliance as well. There's a small handful of that do fight us legally. And so we haven't backed down from those fights. I think when I took over, I roughly had about 60 lawsuits against the planning department. Almost all of them illegal vacation rentals that we're trying to shut down, that we're appealing, as they have the right to do through the court process. And so we fight and uphold in that position that illegal operators no need to shut down, and those fights are just making their way through the court system, and we expect resolution in 2 to 3 years, quite honestly, given the way that works. But when I first took over, or I should say, when I was serving as deputy, we are in discussions with a third-party host monitoring platform that would use certain algorithms and computer programs to monitor websites like Airbnb, VRBO, HomeAway, all these websites, to find out how many operators are advertising. And about 4 years ago, that number was roughly 5,500 operators here in Kauai. When we tabulated those that were legally operating, that meant that there are about 1,500 illegal operations. We have roughly 4,000 legally operating vacation rentals here in Kauai. At that time, about 4 years ago, it was about 1,500 illegally operating. Since that time, we've brought that number down to about 200. So there still are a fair amount of illegal operators out there, but we've been able to definitely bring the number down. And so what we folks saw, and that's kind of just our whole TVR enforcement program in a nutshell. What we guys have seen in the news recently is that we signed a memorandum of understanding with both Expedia, which is a parent company for VRBO and HomeAway, as well as Airbnb, which are essentially platforms that TVR operators can log on to avail themselves to the global market. Everybody that's on Airbnb, California to South Africa, anybody can rent from on these platforms. And for years now, they have, kind of many platforms have turned a blind eye to illegal or not. They're just facilitating the transaction. And so we've been up at the legislature for the past year or two, kind of lobbying for extra authorities to be able to regulate platforms. In those lobbying efforts, a discussion started to evolve between Kauai and those platforms. And all we're saying is just help us get the actual address information. And if you're willing to, we can enforce. And kind of some of that came down to them saying, no, if all you want is the address information, we can get that to you. You let us know which ones are not supposed to be operating, and we'll remove them from our platform. And that's in a nutshell of what that is. So we still are tasked with shutting down illegal operations. But Airbnb, VRBO, and HomeAway, who just signed these agreements with, constitute about 70 to 80% of the market of vacation rental here in Kauai. So by removing that market from the illegal operators, it should help us to get a bit more in the direction of compliance. But our team still has to remain vigilant.
Is that something that those large, conglomerates like Expedia do, in many places, or was this something new for them? Or I understand how frustrating it must be for the county, because it seems like, now I'm biased, right? I'm a realtor on Kauai, but it sure seems like of the 4 islands in the state of Hawaii, we've been the most organized and structured in terms of how we manage vacation rentals. I don't think any of the other islands are, playing at the same level. And now I know you guys have been working for a while to get this done, and it's a huge thing because, you got better fish to fry, so to speak.
My understanding with Expedia right around the time we're signing the MOU is this is the first agreement in the state of Hawaii for any of the counties. But beyond that, it's the first compulsory agreement or compulsory compliance, if you will, between a platform and a municipality. This is ultimately what we wanted when we were essentially asking the legislature for the past 2 years for the authority to regulate platforms. Don't just allow us to regulate land use, allow us the authority to regulate these internet platforms, because the state has the authority, the counties don't. And because other municipalities have gone to regulate the platforms and ultimately ended in about 3 to 4, in some cases 3 to 4 years of litigation, ultimately ending up at the Ninth Circuit Court before coming to agreement. Some were done in settlement, some were done by court order. But my understanding is all the agreements like this have been established via lengthy litigation and or ultimately court order by a judge or series of judges, like say in the circuit court. This is the first compulsory agreement where we didn't go through the litigation. We kind of just said, okay, let's see if we can meet in the middle and see what we need. And there's some municipalities I'll say that want a lot more. And I know that's been a stumbling block for some of the other platforms. And for us is we just need the addresses, and if you're even willing to remove them, we're very sure we can put ink to paper, and that's kind of where we got it.
So Kaaina, we have a question from Judy from Facebook going along these lines. Is the county and Airbnb/Expedia aware there may be repercussions for violation of privacy in those contracts?
Yeah, so we've been very keen on there are some federal privacy protections, one under the Telecommunications Act of 1996, as well as the Federal Decency Act. And so we were navigating that very closely and very particularly. And we followed essentially was the Santa Monica model because they first went after, I won't get into the details, but it's the path for these MOUs have been set essentially by court order under the Ninth Circuit Court. So that's the court right before the Supreme Court. And so Supreme Court hasn't ruled on these agreements, and it could possibly end up there, but Ninth Circuit has, and what we've followed has been pretty much that path to a T. Could there be, privacy issues? Right now, the Ninth Circuit Court is holding us up, but perhaps the Supreme Court won't if we end up there. So. But to the point, we are very aware of that. But all we're asking for is the address, and we're fairly confident that with the court rulings that came out in the Santa Monica case, that we do have the authority to at least just share the address.
Thank you.
Did you see that other question that came in on the look over at the private chat there? Bailey passed on a question that also came from Facebook. There's another question that came in, and it's a little intense question, but we're gonna put it through.
Intense, but okay. So this is from a Facebook user. Can Mr. Hull tell us why the county continues to build without fixing the infrastructure? With COVID, they said they would limit rental cars at the airport, yet a child was recently killed as the overgrowth on the side of the road would not allow him to get out of the way, and the driver was trying to avoid a huge pothole.
So I think the question is a little twofold, but it's a perfectly valid question. As far as the infrastructure, indeed, for certain parts of for certain types of development, we at the county are allowed to exact or have a developer pay in for certain levels of infrastructure. the courts have ruled that of course whatever exaction we take out of the development has to have a proportional nexus to the development. So say we're going to upgrade the highway, for a development of 200 multifamily dwelling units, right? We have to ensure that the impact that they're going to have on the highway is now going to be mitigated by whatever we're requiring the developer to upgrade the highway to. And so that we have to be very careful, as opposed to if we're like, you're going to put in a turn lane and full, 4 miles of 4 lanes. Is that appropriate for, if somebody's coming in with a 5-unit development? If we try to do that, the courts will obviously slap our hands and say, you've overstepped your bounds. There is no proportional nexus to requiring that much. So it's always a bit of a balancing act to ensure there's a proportional nexus on extraction to the upgrades of the infrastructure. As far as upgrades on, roads that are well away from a development, we can't require a development to per se upgrade. Like if there's development in Kauai, we can't have them upgrade the Waimea Highway. It just isn't there. The flip side of the picture, right, is going back to my original point of, well, why are you guys building if you're not upgrading the infrastructure island wide? And to a certain degree, we are trying. Like I was saying, the bill that we have for our roads alone is well beyond the means we already have. So the question is, then why you got to stop building? The answer is, if we stop building in a certain, like in the manner we were talking about, saying let's at least focus it where we can upgrade infrastructure relatively cheap to other types of infrastructure. That's not really going to send it. But if we just stop building, then the message we have to say, given our growth rates, our internal growth rates, is keiki of the island, when you turn a certain age, you need to leave this island because we don't have the shelter or the work jobs for you. And so that's the answer why we still keep on facilitating development. Any new development we want to make sure is done in a manner that the infrastructure is not so costly. But then it is our job, and quite frankly, it's we're still not meeting the means to upgrade the infrastructure as necessary. And again, it's just because we built so much that it costs so much, but we are chasing that federal and state money for those upgrades.
Thank you for answering that question. And I don't see any more online questions, so I'm going to thank you. Is there any closing comments you'd like to say about ARUs or ADUs? I had communicated online that if we have questions that come in afterwards, I'll forward them to you if questions that I can't answer. And I really thank you taking, such a big chunk of your day to help educate. And, we'll do it again. Hopefully, our economy, it's kind of a challenging time, I'd say, for housing here on Kauai, because you spoke to a lot of the challenges that you are aware of and deal with in terms of providing more housing. And now we're going to, place on top of that the economic burden of so many people being out of work, which is not going to make things easier. But it's always seemed like, the whole consortium of community organizations, county organizations, maybe some of our wealthier landowners. I mean, when you were talking about the $1 billion shortfall or whatever, I thought of our the CEO of the platform that we're broadcasting on today. I don't know that his mission in life is saving the county of Kauai, but yesterday I heard Governor Ige, talk about the state's deficit and, how that's going to come down and how we as a state, continue to move on. So I want to thank you for the work that you do. And I really appreciate the work that you do. And, so many things. I know last time I was in your office, you showed me this blackboard with all the different proposals and ideas and so much going on. So I appreciate you and your team and the work that you do so we can keep moving forward.
Yeah, and Ron, Kat, thank you for having me. To all your viewers, Yeah, the only way we're going to get through much of this is understanding, well, knowing that we need to think outside the box and change some of the rules, but then understanding what those rule changes are, so folks like yourself and your viewers can help implement the programs and policies. The ADU, ARU bills, they're never meant per se for large scale development. They really were meant for the mom and pop end, who can more often than not be a driving force in solving the crisis, as well as providing opportunities for their own families. So thank you for having me to explain it. If any of your viewers have questions, please contact the planning department, either email or call us at 241-4050. We're more than willing to have conversations. And like I said, we're walking those clearance forms for you now. Like, we will just fill them out and we'll walk them through for you folks. We're absolutely here and look forward to any questions on the side or concerns that you and your viewers have for us.
Super. We'll talk to you again. Have a great Tuesday. Hui ho and aloha.
Thanks, you guys.